Thanks so much, Pat, and thanks to the organisers for asking me. And I must say, just as I look around the Zoom, I mean, these days when we do Zoom talks, often everyone switches off, but it's a real pleasure to see so many people kept their cameras on. As I look around the people who are watching this, I know that I can see so many friends I've known through 20 years of activism, people I've worked with in refugee campaigns, for example, around Dungavel, and just people I've known in the city and on the left for a very long time. It's a real pleasure to see them, and of course, everyone else here tonight. The talk the title I've been given is Conspiracies and the Far Right, which isn't quite the normal talk I talk to. So I'll start a bit and I'll end a bit by talking about conspiracies. And I was trying to think of something which sort of summed up for me the moment that we're in. And this week I noticed that and obviously just talking about things you see people sharing on social media is anecdotal and garbage, I know that. But I couldn't help but notice something which really struck me this week was that a whole number of my friends on social media, and I'm talking about dozens, 20 or 30 different people, have all been sharing this week one particular internet meme. And it's footage of Buzz Aldrin. If people haven't seen the thing I'm talking about, after I finish speaking, Google it, it's on YouTube. It goes by the exciting title, Buzz Aldrin Punches Guy. What happens in this particular film is that Buzz Aldrin's on, he's obviously giving some talk somewhere in the States, and he's talking about what it was like being involved in the moon landing and so on. And he's accosted by this conspiracy theorist who chases him from place to place, who says, admit it, you're a fraud, admit it, you're a liar, admit it, you never went on the moon. And it all builds up to this scene in the hotel lobby where the conspiracy theorist, he's poking his finger in Buzz Aldrin's face, calling him a liar, calling him a coward, and Buzz Aldrin punches him. And obviously Buzz Aldrin, if you're involved in the moon landing more than 50 years ago, he's not young. And the person he's punching is a lot younger. And there's something really quite shocking about that scene, but also in a sense, exhilarating, the idea that, here's a conspiracy theorist who's obviously talking garbage and he's been confronted with reality and sort of pushed backwards, even by someone who's much older than he is. Now, in that little clip, and in the fact that everyone's sharing it this week, I think there's something of the moment that we're in. One of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons why people were sharing that film is because lots and lots of people on the left, in the broadest possible terms, I'm talking about millions of people, have this idea that essentially what's wrong with the world right now is there are just too many people who believe conspiracy theories. And these are driving what feels like the most dangerous and destructive parts of the right, i.e. the far right. So again, another story which reflects that, starts in the States, but it comes much closer to home. Over the last couple of months, Facebook has been taking down pages associated with the QAnon conspiracy theory. When it started taking them down, something like 3 million people were members of groups supporting QAnon theories. And for people who don't know, QAnon claims that about 5 years ago, this high-level general started revealing to people in the States the truth of what's really happening in America. And what's really happening in America, according to QAnon theory, is there's a good guy, Donald Trump, there's bad people, the Democrat establishment, Jews, all the people who get usually involved in conspiracy theories, all these bad people conspiring behind the scenes. They're involved in a secret war against America, which is very often involved child abuse, child trafficking, paedophilia. There's part of QAnon is the idea that people like Joe Biden are secretly taking drugs out of the bodies of young children and using it somehow to rejuvenate themselves. This absolutely, apologies, batshit crazy idea of how the world works. But A, millions of people are following it. B, such is its social media reach that when you get these QAnon hashtags on Twitter with titles like Save the Children, they've had a reach and an audience hundreds, perhaps 1,000 times as large as established children's charities. And QAnon started marching from online onto the offline world. So they've been holding a number of demonstrations in the United States. There've been a number of Republican candidates who claim to support QAnon theory. Some of them have already won internal Republican elections and are going to be in Congress from next year. there's a phenomenon of, if you look at the demonstrations which have taken place against masking in Britain and against measures to prevent coronavirus spreading, QAnon's clearly providing the kind of ideological skeleton and backbone for large parts of those movements. QAnon talking points in the States are determining when those protests are being called, and they're providing the kind of social movement infrastructure for a movement which obviously has become much more nebulous and much broader. So we've got this real problem. And we've got this real problem, again, if trying to understand why people were sharing that meme about Buzz Aldrin punching the conspiracy theorist. Pretty obviously, there's a kind of explanation which people have in their head, which is essentially this, that the world started going in a really crazy direction when Donald Trump was elected, that Donald Trump breaches protocol with all previous ruling class politicians because he lies, his supporters lies, his supporters thrive on this kind of paranoia and disbelief about what's really going on. That meme was being shared now because obviously there's going to be an American election in 3 weeks' time. Possibly, hopefully, all that stuff could go away. So there's an idea of conspiracy theories. There's a kind of unspoken explanation which lots of people share, which essentially we've had them. We've only had them for about 4 years. They're very recent. They're enormously growing in popularity, and they explain essentially all that's wrong with the world these days. Now I'm going to come back to conspiracy theories at the end. What I want to do though is before I come back to them, I want to kind of go through two projects I've been involved in, two writing projects, which for me offer a kind of better, clearer and more total explanation of what's going on. They don't ignore conspiracy theories, but they tend to, they're arguments which tend to subordinate conspiracy theories and see this as a kind of product of the general crisis rather than actually the explanation of what's wrong. So we're talking essentially to two books I've written. The first one is this, which is called The New Authoritarians: Convergence on the Right, which came out about a year ago. Apologies for people in the room, because there are people in the room who heard me speak to it a year ago, and I'm going to summarize in a matter of 2 or 3 minutes what its argument was. What it was trying to say is, if you look at the world right now, and you look at why it feels like the far right's growing, why it feels like the right's winning, essentially it's because there are a series of convergence dynamics which are bringing together different bits of the right and the far right. So that what's happening is there's a process of kind of cooperation and collaboration that's taking place, one thing across borders. One of the reasons why the right and the far right feel so powerful is they're able to share money, ideas, resources across borders in a way that they really weren't able to do 10 or 20 years ago. Another thing that's going on is there's a process of alliance and agreement which is taking place across ideological lines, which used to be considered to be absolute. You know, it used to be part of the political wisdom of any governing centre-right party that while you might signal a bit to your base and dog whistle in a racist direction or things like that, you'd never try and promote these sorts of people into positions of influence or power because you'd recognise that they're involved in a different project to what you were, and ultimately they were toxic to what you were trying to do. And that whole wisdom, as it were, has completely disappeared in the last 4 or 5 years. The other thing I try and talk about in that book is how a lot of what's happening at the moment isn't just a convergence, as it were, between different political strands or across borders. It's also a process of cultural, particularly online phenomena, turning into offline realities, and these two things working together. So just to give some examples, I'll give some examples of only one of these processes, the notion of collaboration across ideological lines. If you go back to the 1990s, again, focusing on the States, although I'm really not trying to suggest these phenomena are limited to the United States, I'm just giving these as examples. Back in the 1990s, it was part of the wisdom of Republicans that you might have people within your support who are far right, but you wouldn't let them get beyond a certain point. In the 1990s, David Duke tried to become a Republican senator. He won elections, so he was going to be the official Republican candidate. The response of the Republican Party was to take out adverts in the state where he was standing, calling on Republican voters to vote Democrat to stop someone like David Duke being seen as a normal Republican. Or if you want a more recent example, people may know that kind of the start of the phenomenon of Donald Trump becoming the president of the United States or becoming any sort of political figure at all was early on in the Obama presidency. Donald Trump became associated with a conspiracy theory which claimed that Obama wasn't a legitimate American citizen, therefore wasn't allowed to stand to be president. He was in reality Kenyan, and this was just complete garbage conspiracy theory, but it was promoted by Trump, and that raised him to the position of political prominence, which he was later able to trade on in standing in 2015-16. The point I want to make is that when this idea was first pushed by Trump, which is going back to 2008-9, again, it was utterly resisted by mainstream Republicans. You can actually look at moments in previous election cycles. So when John McCain was confronted on the campaign trail by people arguing this sort of paranoid nonsense about Obama, and you see meetings where he lays into them. He says, this is not Republican politics. We will not win talking about this stuff. We are a serious centre-right mainstream kind of politics. And the things you're talking about have no place in our vision of the world. Obviously, track forward 8, 10, 12 years, and that isn't the position today. Now I'm not, in saying all this, I'm really not trying to suggest that conservative politics in Britain or America 30 years ago was essentially sound and healthy, you know? That's really not the point I'm making. There was always a degree of real long-term interest and, you know, alongside the public disavowals, behind the scenes, you know, acknowledgements and alliances. And, you know, for example, I noticed that some of the people in the call have backgrounds in Italian politics. So we'll know, for example, during the years of lead in the 60s and 70s, how often the centre-right would use the far-right as a kind of leverage mechanism to justify what they were doing. But there was a distance. That's what's collapsed. That distance has gone away. So the right and the far right are recreating themselves with a centre-right which has moved in a direction which is further to the right, certainly than the centre-right of 10 or 20 years ago. Now, that's the first thing I want to talk about. And the other thing I want to talk about, and this I'll take a bit longer over, is the argument that now that we hear in the States, and often when people talk about, I think the process I'm talking about conspiracy theories, the way the right is changing, particularly with the election coming up, the threat, you know, is Donald Trump about to take America in a sort of new direction, which will be significantly more authoritarian than anything that's happened in recent history? Often this tends to get summarized down to and shrunk into a simple point: Donald Trump is a fascist or Donald Trump isn't a fascist. So what I wanted to do in the next 10 minutes or so is try and talk about another book, and the book I've actually got that's come out in the last few weeks, which is a book about fascism, theories of fascism, and how people in the interwar left, particularly interwar Marxists, tried to understand fascism and trying to reclaim an idea of fascism which isn't just, you know, we're worried about the present, so we have to decide whether the present is fascist or not, and fitting everything around that, but trying to have an understanding of fascism which could equip us not just for the next 4 weeks, but in 4 years' time, in 8 years' time, in 12 years' time. Because after all, one of the strange things about our world is that these debates about is this or that movement fascist actually been going on, certainly for me, they've been going on my entire adult life. Was political Islam, was that fascist? Was George Bush, was he fascist? If you go further back, every third world dictator in the last 30 years, Saddam Hussein, was Saddam Hussein fascist? So you need to have an understanding of fascism. It's of particular relevance now, but actually you need to have a theory of fascism which enables you, it seems to me, to understand not just the immediate crisis, but the longer term ways in which politics work, and understands the 30s, as it were, on its own terms. So I'm going to try and summarize that in the next sort of 6 or 7 minutes. The first thing, one of the things I take on board is, this is from a speech given called a man called Palmiro Togliatti, who went on to be a leading member of the Italian Communist Party and played, you know, one of those mixed and not by any means entirely heroic roles in the post-war settlement in terms of the Italian Communist Party and the recreation of a kind of normality in post-war Italy. I've got a quote from him which was written 15 years earlier when he was a very young activist in Cador and associated with the communist movement. And he was expressing ideas which weren't just his, but were essentially the ideas of an entire generation of Marxists, some of whom would become reformist socialists, some of whom would become communists, some of whom would become revolutionaries of completely different stripe. But essentially, they all more or less agreed about what fascism was. So I'll just start with a quote from him. He said, talking to an international audience in 1928 about the experience of being in Italy during the rise of fascism. He said, it's become customary to use the word fascism to designate every form of fascism. A comrade is arrested, a workers' demonstration is brutally dispersed by the police, a court imposes a savage sentence on some militants of the labour movement. A communist parliamentary fraction sees its right infringed or abrogated. In short, whenever the so-called democratic freedoms sanctified by bourgeois constitutions are attacked, one hears the cry, fascism is here, fascism has arrived. It should be realised this isn't just a question of terminology. If someone thinks it's reasonable to use the term fascism to designate every form of reaction, so be it. But I don't see the advantage we gain, except perhaps an agitational one. The actuality is something different. Fascism is a particular, specific type of reaction. So the first thing here that I hope you've heard in what he's talking about is that fascism is a form of reactionary politics. It's a form of politics which believes that there should be inequality in every sphere of life, that black people should be less equal than they are now, that women should be less equal than they are now, that workers should be less equal than they are now. But it's also a form of reactionary modernism. Often, you kind of think about a reactionary, and the idea that certainly I have in the back of my head, I mean, maybe this tells you more about me than it does anyone else. But when I hear the word reactionary, I think of this sort of English duffer with a tweed coat, reminiscing about the great days of aristocratic rule or something like that. Fascism wasn't reactionary like that. Fascism believed in a machine world. It believed in cars, it believed in cinemas, it believed in radio, it believed in new technology. What it wanted to do is it wanted to strip out of the factories the power which workers had gained there, but it still wanted there to be factories and it still wanted there to be people working in them. It was an ideology that was an ideology of everything, that people who became fascists ended up with a total view of everything. And it was reaction in the sense that it was inegalitarian, but it was also reactionary in a modernist way. Another thing to say about fascism, which kind of brings out the difference between fascism and other forms of reactionary politics, for example, conservative politics, is that it was much, much, much more serious about mass participation in politics than conservatives were. Conservatives were to some extent willing to make peace with the present day reality, whatever that was. The fascists wanted to fight a revolution, or more accurately, a counter-revolution against their present. And to achieve that, they knew they had to motivate and mobilize hundreds of thousands or millions of people. They wanted to take the working class out of politics forever, but to do that, they could only succeed by mobilizing millions of people, including many unemployed workers and many people on the fringes of the working class, petty bourgeoisie, whatever. So it was a mass politics. Now, part argue in my book of what's specific to the Marxist understanding of fascism is this idea that fascism is a mass reactionary politics. There have been other kinds of politics which have tried to be mass and reactionary in some combination. But what's distinctive about fascism, I say, if you go back to the theorists of the 30s, is this idea that the mass and the reactionary elements are held in balance, neither predominates over the other. So, for example, again, this is something I can only allude to in a couple of sentences. I don't have time to do more on this, but if people want to ask questions, I'm more than happy to. For the writers writing in the 20s and 30s, like Clara Zetkin or Walter Benjamin or Leon Trotsky or any of these different writers, they were looking at a Europe where most of the governments were actually in some form mass reactionary governments. Most of them had to some extent given up on democracy. Most of them were authoritarian rule. Most of them were counter-revolutionary. But all the others begin with a burst of counter-revolutionary activity and then revert to something like normality. Fascism, because it's much more serious about mass participation, keeps the mass content going, continues to radicalize in office, and in the end sells its supporters the idea that if you can't get the revolution, as in the revolution of the transformation of their day-to-day lives, you could get a different kind of revolution, a world which is at war with itself on national lines, a world in which it's possible to fight race war and ultimately genocide against significant minorities of people. So that's what fascism was. Now, coming back now to the present, if that's right, how much use is there in terms of seeing the world we're in now as a fascist moment? The short answer is not that much. The reason why in the 70s, for example, people wanted to have a theory of fascism is they wanted to understand how you could have regimes which, even in the richest countries in the world, set up camps, concentration camps, jailed political opponents, abolished democracy, and caused a mass destruction of people's living standards. Well, that's not happened. What I suppose I'm trying to do in my book is get people to use the label fascism a bit less because they understand fascism better, but also to understand better how it was that fascism could come about. Because while we're not in a fascist world, parts of the processes which led to the creation of fascism are present. Some of those dynamics of radicalization on the right are there, even if we have not yet reached anything like the end point that the 30s got to. So some of the phrases that people use when talking about books, so, you know, what I think you're about, Dave, is I think you're about trying to teach people to use the label fascism less and understand it better. Yeah, that's it. Or maybe another way you could put it is I want people to, if you have, for example, if you have friends in the States who are seriously living right now in a moment of fear, my God, what is going to happen if Donald Trump seriously tries to steal this election? You know, could we be going in a really, really bad direction? What I want to try and create is a kind of combination of simultaneously people understanding where that fear comes from and taking that fear seriously, while at the same time absolutely insisting that we've not got there yet. And if you want to measure how we've not got there yet, it's really very obvious. When Donald Trump was standing for office in 2016, turned around to American voters, he said, vote for me and I'll make sure that there are double, treble, 10 times as many deportations as there were under Obama. 4 years later, are there more or less? There are less. Donald Trump said, if you vote for me, I'm going to jail Hillary Clinton. Is she jailed? No, she's not. Donald Trump said to his supporters, if you vote for me, I'm going to get the Mexicans to pay for a border wall and I'm going to build hundreds of miles of it. Well, last time I checked, of the 600 or so miles which have been built in the 8 years before Donald Trump came to power, they're all still there. And compared to those 600 miles, he's added 9. So we have this kind of really complex moment where we've got leaders who are willing to talk in the most authoritarian way imaginable, but actually their programs for government are not programs for revolution or even counter-revolutionary transformation. Their programs for government so far are much more of the same. And somehow we have to grasp both sides of that reality. Now, I'm getting near to the end now. You may recall I began by talking about conspiracy theories. I've been trying to think why in that context are all these friends of mine sharing the meme about Buzz Aldrin punching this conspiracy theorist. And it seems to me the first thing that I find really striking about that meme when I look at it again, I really would urge people to have looked at it, because to me it's a fascinating thing about our moment. The thing that really I find revealing about the footage is it was actually filmed 20 years ago. And if you look at it, it's obvious. Buzz Aldrin's now in his 80s. You know, he's not in a physical state to beat up conspiracy theorists. What people do is they're taking back this kind of footage of some heroic from some middle distance past to kind of say to themselves, look, if another old white guy, Biden, wins the election, he'll deliver us for us, he'll land the punch. And all this shit that we hate, these conspiracy theories, this nonsense, this right-wing reactionary stuff, will just go away. Now, it seems to me, if you kind of think about that, and obviously there's a danger of taking things too seriously in life sometimes. I'm not trying to say that the whole world should be read through this one meme, which a few 100,000 people have been sharing, but, you know, there are a number of things that I think are kind of wrong in terms of the way of looking at the world which it teaches people. That almost like over-focusing on conspiracy theories teaches people. Firstly, it tends to lead to the idea that the antidote to conspiracy theory is some kind of something will save us, some great imminent truth, some person, some idea, Buzz Aldrin with his right, whatever it is, will just make all the conspiracy theories go away. And I'm not suggesting anyone seriously believes that, but that idea is always there. Another thing it does is it kind of exaggerates actually the numerical importance of the conspiracy theorists. If you look at QAnon, they had 3 million people on Facebook pages, but Facebook closed them down, and they're now more or less scattered. The number of Republican congressmen and women who believe in QAnon after the election will be around half a dozen, but there will be 400 or 500 Republicans who don't believe in QAnon, and they're still going to be there, and they're still going to be voting for Donald Trump if they get a chance. It exaggerates, it transforms the fact that we have opponents in the world and turns them into the actors and the agents in history. And it also, in a sense, it misattributes and misexplains why it is that people like Donald Trump, why it feels like they're winning. The most basic thing about Trump, it seems to me, is not that he derives his power essentially from new things in American politics. Undoubtedly, they contribute. But the most striking thing about Trump is he's able to draw on the power of old things in American politics, on the castural state, on the American war machine, on the Republican voting base, which has gone over entirely to him, even while he represents a step rightwards from the old Republicans. That actually Trump is shaped by all these forms of old power. And if you only concentrate on what's new, like, for example, the Democrats do by refusing to talk about the war, the prisons, refusing to criticize those things, then you leave all those forms of power intact so that they can constantly recreate a Trump or someone like him who can stand again in office in 4 years' time. So I suppose the point I'm building towards is, while having absolute sympathy with people in the States who are seriously worried about what's going to happen in the next 4 weeks, which is entirely rational and reasonable thought, I'm also inviting people to think that actually, in the end, if we're going to get a more equal world, it's wrong to look for saviors. It's wrong to look for people the likes of Buzz Aldrin. It's wrong to think that our enemy is essentially people like us who are just more stupid than we are and don't get it. What we somehow have to create a culture is where we're no longer the objects of history, whether it's the objects of a savior or the objects of conspiracy, but we're the subjects of our own lives, and that we can change the world. And in changing the world, obviously, we can try and create the basis so that ideas like the conspiracy theories can be pushed to the margins where they belong.